Yo, ma. The computer was being slow about recording here, but we're live. Hello. I hope you're doing well. Hope all of the quarantining has led you to good health, perhaps good times with your families, some fun things, nothing too depressing. Hope no one's sick, for goodness sake. Anything like that. All right. I have the slides in front of me, ladies and gentlemen. Today we talk about John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Kennedy. It's a troubling legacy, ladies and gentlemen. I got to be 100% honest with you. Here we go. When I was a younger man, big Kennedy fan. When I was growing up, I used to write essays and I'd throw Kennedy quotes in there. I would do that kind of thing. The more you study Kennedy, I find, the less I think Kennedy is a great fellow, dude, man, president, you name it. So I have to say right off the bat that as much as I try and keep my biases to myself, I am not a great fan of John Fitzgerald Kennedy for reasons that I will try and detail while still being fair to the legacy of the nation's youngest president. So I start out with this. If I'm looking at that first slide, and if you don't have the slides, ladies and gentlemen, this first slide is the most important one. I'm going to come back to it when we talk civil rights because I want to dig deep on what that map looks like later on in the civil rights portion of the discussion. But for right now, I just want to look at that map and point out a few things. Number one, in 1960, Kennedy wins the closest election in a long time. He defeats former Vice President Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon is not that much older than Kennedy. Kennedy is running at 42, and he's going to be the youngest elected president when he gets in there. He'll be 43 when he finally takes the office. Now, the youngest serving president is Teddy Roosevelt. He was 42 when William McKinley died, so that's a close one. But Nixon's only 4 years older. But the Kennedy campaign makes a big deal of age and image in this campaign. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. As we've done in the past, I want you to watch some videos as we go along here. Now, I want you to watch the first one first. That's the one in the upper left-hand corner. Now, be prepared because this is a set of bars. This is a song that will stick in your head. You thought I Like Ike was a jammin' jingle. This has got it beat. So go watch the first one, ladies and gentlemen. Time out. Go watch it. Oh, you're back. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me, if you want a man. Now, here's the key line in that jingle. I'm going to try to not mess it up, all right? The jingle says, if you want a man who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new. A man who's old enough to know and young enough to do. Well, it's up to you. It's up to you. It's simply up to you. It's Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy. Okay. Old enough to know, young enough to do. That's a fine balance that the Democratic Party is throwing here in 1960. Because keep in mind, Kennedy is young. That's the knock on him. You say to someone, I don't know, this kid's kind of young. Is he going to know what to do? What's his background? Well, Kennedy's been in the Senate. He's been a politician. He comes from a prominent family, right? I've got a picture of him and his brothers on here. I told the story in class of how the older Kennedy, Joe Kennedy Sr., wanted one of his boys to be the president of the United States. And, well, the oldest of the sons, Joe Jr., passed away in World War II. And then the mantle of responsibility fell to Jack, to John F. Kennedy. Now, that's not the life that he thought he was going to lead. Okay, JFK thought that he was going to have kind of that life that's, I'm never going to be king, but I'm going to have all the trappings of an important family. So I'm going to have a party life. I'm going to be big with the ladies. Holla. And it isn't anything that he expects that he's going to have a life of political responsibility. And here it is. Now, Kennedy, one of the things that, as at the outset, I said, I'll be fair about this. I'm not a huge fan. One of the things that you have to understand about Kennedy is this guy is not loyal at all. The Kennedy men, as a group, father and sons, all of them go through a number of very high-profile affairs. So in that ad, where at the end they show a picture of the loving husband and the wife and the kid, no, thank you very much. Yeah, there's plenty of other stuff going on there, JFK. Okay, so when he is running for president, The Democrats want to put forward this idea of youth and vigor, right? Because remember who was president? Who's the president right before him? Think for a second. Dwight Eisenhower. Good job. And Eisenhower's vice president was Nixon. Now, between the two of them, one of them's in their 60s and one of them's in their 40s, but the general American perception is that they're both like 79 years old. It's a couple of old farts. They're off playing golf half the time. They never seem to do much. It just kind of same old, same old. So here's what we need to do. We need to shake up the system with someone who is old enough to know and young enough to do. And it's Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy. Okay, that whole thing. Kennedy is a very charismatic fellow, right? He has this image of being young and exuberant and charismatic, and he's good looking. This is, for the record, the first year of televised presidential debates, 1960. And in the first debates, Kennedy gets on there. A little bit of background here. Kennedy's been down in Palm Springs hanging with the Rat Pack. Holla at your boys. And he is tanned and bronzed, and he's got his hair in good shape. And he gets on the TV and he's like, and everyone's like, "I'm not guy's so good looking." Okay. On the other hand, Nixon has been campaigning his backside off because Eisenhower won't give the man any support. Eisenhower was a lukewarm supporter of Nixon at best. There's this really sweet clip. I didn't put it on here, but if you're looking for it, go have a look, where a reporter says to President Eisenhower during the time that Nixon is running for president, he says to Eisenhower, "Hey, I was wondering if you could give me an example of a policy that Nixon has proposed as vice president that you then used," right? Because Nixon's saying he's experienced. Can you give an example of a time when Nixon gave you a great idea and then you used it? And Eisenhower goes, "Well, if you give me about a week, I might be able to." Ooh, rough. Damn, roasting your boy. So Eisenhower, not much support for Nixon. Nixon's out here running himself all over the country. He shows up for that initial debate and he goes against advisors' logic. The advisors say, "Listen, boss, it's going to be hot and sweaty out there. Put some makeup on." And Nixon's kind of like, "I'm not putting on makeup." Kennedy's got some makeup on. And so if you tuned in to watch, you get a Kennedy that's composed, calm, good looking. You get a Nixon who is a sweating bag, and that does not help. And you're going to say, "Holiday, really? That makes a difference?" Weirdly enough, studies show that if you watched the debate, you thought Kennedy won. But if you listened to the debate on radio, you thought Nixon came out ahead. So that line between political ideas and political image blurred strongly in 1960, right? The Democrats want to appeal to the youth of John Kennedy. Now, also when I look in that ad, and if you need to go back and have a look at it, do that. But in the ad, you look at who's in it. In 1952, when they made that "I Like Ike" ad, if you want to go back and watch that one, that one's pretty lily white, in all fairness. You look around, it's like, got it. Yep, that's what I saw. It's 1950s America. On the other hand, the Kennedy ad, African Americans, seniors, blue collar workers, military guys, young people. So here's the Democratic push for a group that in the 1930s we called the Roosevelt Coalition, the group of people who voted for Franklin Roosevelt in 32 and 36 and kept performing for the Democrats. That's who Kennedy's trying to pull into the country. So Kennedy has this broad base that we're trying to get the support of. Okay, now Kennedy realizes he's young. He realizes he's inexperienced. One of the things they do is they go out and they get him an experienced running mate. Okay, long-time Senate runner, Lyndon Johnson from Texas, who thought that he was going to be president. He's a little bit, whatever word you want to put in there, that the Democratic Party is running this young pup from Massachusetts and not him. He's been in the government since the freaking New Deal. He's been working his butt off, and here comes this upstart, and he gets the nomination. Not too happy about it. So he gets the vice presidency, and in a way, it's a balance, right? It's the young Northeasterner and the experienced, aged, wise Southerner from Texas. That's a nice balanced ticket in that way. That being said, it's a very close election. I don't want to look at the demographics of geography yet. I want to save that for my civil rights portion here. But you look at that map, it's a tight election. Okay, especially in the popular vote. Look at that, 100,000 votes. All told, about 70 million Americans went to the polls, and Richard Nixon lost by 100,000 votes. This is one of those elections that if you believe in the conspiracy theories, you believe in people rigging elections, there's a lot of smoke in this one. States like Illinois and West Virginia, states where eventually the Kennedys come out in front. There's a lot of stuff happened in those states that people look back on it and they go, I don't know if Nixon lost by that much, but Nixon does lose. And he thinks to himself, that's my shot. I am 47, I think, at the time, and I am done with my political career. And he limps back off to California and he thinks, well, that's it. You know, liberalism has triumphed. We've had JFK, and this is the direction things are going to go. Now, here's what Nixon doesn't know and what no one knows. This liberalism, this way of seeing the world that becomes John Kennedy and will later be Lyndon Johnson, that is going to burn out. And by the end of the 1960s, Americans are going to be looking for a solid conservative, and Richard Nixon will be back. So let's put Nixon on the back burner for now, but he'll be back. Okay. What else to point out? There are 2 more videos on this slide. Go watch those. One of them you've probably seen before. That's the first one, a little bit of a clip from the famous speech about ask not what your country can do for you. And then the second one is about JFK saying that we should go to the moon. So time out, go watch those 2. Aha, that JFK idealism. I think when I was a younger fellow, I loved that. And I still do. I still do like a great speech and a little bit of rah-rah. I like politicians to motivate me and convince me I'm a part of a cause. I'm not jaded and old completely yet. I still like that stuff. But there's a lot of what Kennedy says that is not exactly going to hold up. Okay, so we're going to look first here at the Cold War. At the end of the day, that's really where Kennedy wants to focus, right? Kennedy's passion is not the domestic affairs. We'll find that out later on today. But for the most part, if you're a JFK advisor, his biggest moments are foreign policy moments. Okay, so let us, ladies and gentlemen, go to the second slide, if you will. Okay, on the second slide, I have a guy in military dress holiday and then a guy in a baseball outfit. Explain, please. So on the left, Fulgencio Batista. Batista was the American-supported leader of Cuba. Now, remember about Eisenhower. Eisenhower loves these kind of hard, right-wing, conservative elements serving as a government, and that resists socialism. Cuba, in case you have no idea, about 100 miles off the coast of the United States, a close place. And it is really a portion of the world that since the Spanish-American War, we've had a very, very deep interest in. So in 1959, when the fellow on the right, Fidel Castro, who, for the record, was quite the Major League Baseball prospect as a young man, had a tryout with the Washington Senators, could have played professional baseball, but decided to go home and pursue politics. And when he did, he led a socialist revolution that overthrew the Batista regime and turned itself towards a focus on the Soviet Union. Now, this happens under the Eisenhower leadership. Eisenhower is watching this take place. This happens in 1959 when Eisenhower was still president. And it's a bit of a victory for the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union can be like, 100 yards from the American coast, we got this outpost sitting out here, and the Soviet Union is going to funnel all sorts of money into Cuba, right? The Cubans are going to get all of this Soviet infrastructure. It's one of the reasons today that if you visit Cuba, it's a weird thing, but stay with me for a moment. If you visit Cuba, which Americans can do now, you see 2 forms of infrastructure. One, 1950s America. There's all these 1950s American cars because that was when Cuba was very much in the influence circle of the United States, and those were the best cars you could buy in the world. So there's a lot of those that have survived through. And the other thing you see is like late 1970s, early 1980s Soviet-made stuff. That was when Cuba is still a part of the Soviet sphere, and the Soviets are funding them. Now, when the Soviet Union collapses in the late 1980s and the money dries up, well, the Cubans are in for a financial hurt. And as a result of it, you end up with this society, as I said, when you look at it today, is not very strong and has these elements of 1950s Americanism and 1970s, 80s Sovietism. It's really an odd mix, but it makes sense when you look at it. So, what to do about this new socialist in our backyard? Eisenhower was mad as heck about the entire thing, and he decided that he would put together a plan to try and oust Castro. This is a plan that he never greenlights. In other words, he never officially says, let's do it. And as a part of his presidency, Eisenhower, I said a week ago in the video, very kind of cautious about these things behind the scenes. The plan involves bringing in people who used to be in Cuba, people who have fled Cuba, and having them overthrow the government. And Eisenhower was never convinced that this thing could work. And so he had the CIA develop the plan, and then he had them put it on the back burner. And he basically, in the handoff of power to Kennedy, he mentions to Kennedy, hey, there's this thing. We thought about doing it, but we didn't do it. So picking up to the next slide, Kennedy, fresh in office, thinks, how do I convince people that I'm not young, that I'm not foolish, that I'm not inexperienced? Here's what I'll do. I will overthrow the Castro regime with this plan that Eisenhower put together. Now, unfortunately, this plan is not a good plan. It calls for a training of former Cubans who are now living in Guatemala. And they are going to be trained by CIA personnel, American personnel. They're going to use equipment that has been sprayed over, in essence, where it doesn't say on it, the United States of America. But if you do some scrubbing, that's what it's going to say. And they're going to charge into a bay on the southwestern portion of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. And when they arrive, they're going to surge onto the beach. They're going to overthrow the Castro regime. They're going to put back up the free Cuban flag. They're going to reestablish relationships with the United States. And Kennedy, 90 days on the job, can be like, mic drop, ladies and gentlemen, boo to the yah. One win for me, one loss for the Soviet Union and its satellite Cuban Castro-led communist regime. Booyah! Okay? Didn't go that way. Why didn't it go that way, Holiday? Well, there's a lot of security leaks. Some of the guys who were coming told people they were coming. The Castro regime knew exactly where they were going to be. And so when these soldiers showed up at the Bay of Pigs, they got hammered. 1,400 of them arrived. 1,100 got captured. 100 as well were dead. 200 of them managed to escape. But when the dust settled, here's what was clear. Number one, the United States had attempted to overthrow the leadership of a country, and it was blatantly obvious this time. This wasn't a coup in the middle of the night. This wasn't a guy who had a heart attack or some sort of accidental incident. It was absolutely blood on our hands. Number two, Kennedy looks dumb. We look foolish. We tried to overthrow the regime. Isn't the United States the one that tells people don't go in and meddle in the affairs of foreign countries? That's right, we do that. And we're not supposed to be doing this. So Kennedy thought he was going to come off looking, ha-ha. And unfortunately, what do you look? You look young. You look inexperienced. You look foolish. Damn. Lived up to all the stereotypes, my friend. So unfortunately for Kennedy, it is an absolute debacle. Now, it also heightens the tension with the Soviet Union because the United States has been running this line of rhetoric that the Soviets should let the Eastern European countries go, that they should be free to run their own nations. And here we are trying to absolutely replace the leadership in Cuba. Oh, boy. What a mess you've made here, Kennedy. Unfortunate for you. So if I'm Kennedy, kind of looking for a new way to reestablish, like, okay, strike one. What can I do next? On the next slide, probably the most famous Kennedy event, besides his assassination, I would say, is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is an attempt by both sides, the United States and the Soviet Union, to show their strength. Now, I have a video here, a little bit of background before you go watch it. And this one's going to take you, I think it might be about 12, 14 minutes, somewhere in there. The video is from a longer documentary with a guy named Robert McNamara. McNamara was the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, and then after Kennedy's death, under Lyndon Johnson. towards the end of his life, he becomes like the head of the World Bank. He goes on to this very prestigious writing career, and he writes a book, and this documentary is based on it, called The Fog of War, right? Where McNamara looks back at his experiences in his lifetime in an effort to try and understand where the United States went wrong, where we went right, what was at the base of these decisions. So this portion you're about to watch here is a part of a much larger documentary that, by the way, is available on YouTube if you want to go look for the whole thing, called The Fog of War. And it's a fascinating life that McNamara lives. We'll see another clip of this when we get to the Vietnam War here with our next unit. But this one is about the Cuban Missile Crisis and about how the United States got into the shoes of the Soviets and tried to understand them. And that's what saved the day. So time out, go watch the video. Good to see you. You good? All right. What's cool about that one, I think, is that they have those phone conversations. And you think to yourself, man, that's amazing that here, I know we're getting close to the president holiday. I know that. But it is cool to kind of hear the voice of Tommy Thompson and McNamara and Kennedy speaking about what it is that the United States should do. And in that moment, Kennedy really, I think, learns just how diehard some members of the military are. There are members of the military who openly are encouraging, and McNamara points this out, nuclear war and winning a nuclear war. Now, at this point, the Soviets have enough nuclear weaponry to make a mess of the United States. That's what this whole thing is about. The missiles that are planted on that west side of the island are enough to destroy the eastern portion of the United States. 90 million Americans are in harm's way. So that kind of an idea, Kennedy begins to realize the military is a little too gung-ho, a little too willing to put it all out on the table and say, in essence, won't this go well? Well, if it doesn't, who's going to know? Right? There's this great line in a book called 13 Days, and there's a movie called 13 Days as well, based on the book. But the book's written by Kennedy's brother, Robert. And Robert is the secretary. No, he's not. Sorry. He's the attorney general, I beg your pardon, during Kennedy's administration. And he writes in the book, fantastic line. He writes, I marveled at how many times the military proposed solutions that had the advantage of the fact that if they went poorly, no one would be around to know. And that is the revelation among the Kennedy boys. Both Bobby and Jack begin to get this sense that the military is far too willing to gamble here. That if we all throw down nuclear weapons and the world turns into the land of the cockroaches, then no one's going to be around to be like, that's a bad idea there. That's a bad idea. Okay. So in a way, the event slows down Kennedy's Cold Warrior status. It makes him more aware of the global geopolitical stance. This is one of the things I said at the early point that I wasn't a big fan. This is one of the early things that I will give you some props on, Kennedy. Good handling of the crisis. Now, at the end of the day, both sides back down. Both sides are willing to remove missiles that threaten the other side. But as a leader of the world, this scares Kennedy a little bit. It looks like, and you can hear it in that video where he says, I don't think there's any way we get these missiles out of here unless we attack Cuba, right? Kennedy thinks he's going to become a wartime president. There's no doubt about it. There's going to be attack on, if it's not against the United States mainland, it's going to be against a U.S. proxy, a South Korea, a Japan, a West Berlin, a West Germany, a European spot. Something's going to get hit. He thinks that's absolutely certain, and diplomacy saves the day. And it makes him a better president, a better politician. As I said, this is one of the things that I will be like, hats off to you there, Mr. Kennedy. Well done. Well done. All right. A brief note about Vietnam. Now, I know we keep checking back in on Vietnam. We did so with Truman. We did so with Eisenhower. And here we are with Kennedy. And the reason that we haven't really committed ourselves to a deep commitment is that the United States is not fighting the war in Vietnam yet. We will early in our next unit under the leadership of President Johnson. But as for Kennedy, this is one of those great iffy history moments, right? If you look at what I have written here, Kennedy doesn't like the American position in Vietnam. We try a lot to transform it. Kennedy puts more advisors into Vietnam. Now, I use the word advisors there, and maybe your brain goes, that sounds like soldiers' holiday. It's not. It's military people training the South Vietnamese to fight. They're not doing the fighting themselves. Now, they might die. You might get hit in bombing raids and things, but these are not guys out there in sort of toe-to-toe situations against the the North Vietnamese, I beg your pardon. They also tried this strategic Hamlet program, which involved taking the Vietnamese people from their homes in the jungles and moving them to fortified camps, which then the United States and the South Vietnamese could defend them in, which to the people of South Vietnam felt not like you're defending me, it felt like you were imprisoning me in a camp that I didn't want to live in. So that went over poorly. In 1963, Kennedy, before he's dead, supports the removal of Diem, the leader that Eisenhower had put in control in South Vietnam. And Kennedy thought that what we were going to have here was a bloodless coup. It was anything but. Members of the military murdered both Diem and his brother. And if you're Kennedy, you're looking at this going, I don't see how we come out ahead here. I don't see what that looks like. The popular support in the North is so strong, and the ability to fight in the South is so weak. So in the last months before he passes away, Jack Kennedy is openly discussing an American removal of the presence in Vietnam. As I said a second ago, that Cold Warrior status for Kennedy begins to morph after the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Kennedy is willing to say, I think we should get out of here. Maybe America doesn't have to be the ATM of freedom of democracy every single place, everywhere. Maybe this is one of those places that we can just say, we can't win here. There's no win. We need to get out of here. Now, if you're a conspiracy person, there are those who believe that one of the groups that might have been responsible for the assassination of Kennedy is the military-industrial complex. The people who make not just the military decisions, the Pentagon, but also those people who make the hardware that the military counts on, the people who make the guns and the tanks and the planes and all of these things, and that they would have been disadvantaged by the removal of the American position. To put that another way, if you offered me 10 years of America in a major war, that is to say 500,000 American soldiers on the ground, or you offered me nothing at all, I think I'm going to make more money as a military contractor with a war on. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Kennedy removing the American presence from Vietnam might have led to less of an order from the military or an order from the defense contractors in that sense. Maybe you don't believe in that theory. There are others. We'll talk about it in a moment, though. Okay. For a second, I want to go back to civil rights, and I want to go back to the map that begins the unit, if you will. I know I'm bouncing a little bit, folks, but promise it makes some sense. This is one of the areas where you can really take a crack at Jack Kennedy. You can say to President Kennedy, give me a list of your civil rights achievements, President Kennedy. I'll wait. Kennedy, unfortunately, does not have much of a glowing record in the area of civil rights. Now, he had campaigned on doing some things. Like, for instance, he had said, I'm going to end discrimination in federally assisted housing projects. Did that happen? It took him a year and a half. He eventually did it, but it's not something he did quickly. There are leaders of the movement in civil rights, people like Martin Luther King Jr., who are on President Kennedy, a Democrat, right? Democrats get a lot of African-American votes to do something about civil rights, but let's understand the pinch that John Kennedy is in. Let's go back to that original map. Okay, you with me? This is a close election. Kennedy barely sneaks out the popular vote total. Now, the electoral vote total, you might say, is a little more decisive. Fair point. Okay, but look at the Republicans starting to make gains in the South. Look at the red in the South. That is a sign of the Democratic Party losing its stronghold. The Democrats have owned the South, and they're losing that. And the reason they're losing it is because the voters of the South, and when I say voters of the South, please understand that I mean, generally speaking, the white voters of the South. Are there areas where African Americans are voting? Yes. But keep in mind, things like poll taxes, literacy clauses, and just general physical intimidation still a part of the voting image in the southern part of the United States. That is to say, when you start to see victories For Republicans in the South, what that means is that the Southern support for the Democratic Party is lessening because the Democratic Party is starting to lean over towards the civil rights agenda. Now, I said a second ago, not that much at all, right? And it isn't that much, but it's starting to lean that way. You'll notice here, just for the fun of it, Harry Byrd, independent. Last time, when I did the video about civil rights, I read to you from the Southern Manifesto from 1956. Byrd, one of the authors of the Southern Manifesto. Notice he picks up some electoral college votes. Not a ton, 15. Okay, but what's his stance, Holiday? Segregation. Segregation. That's my stance. Okay, don't make a video of me saying segregation. That's my stance. Don't do that, please. Okay, that's not going to be funny. And notice there are victories for Harry Byrd down here in his native Oklahoma. The portion he gets some of the electoral college vote there, not the whole state though, but also in the deep South as well. And as a result of that, you can start to see the Democrats are having trouble. This is Kennedy's issue. Here's my dilemma. If I push to the left, if I push whole hog for civil rights, okay, here's what's going to happen. A lot of those states down there that are blue are going to turn red. They're going to become conservative states. Now, maybe eventually we register enough African-American voters in the South to weigh that the other way. Those African-Americans generally vote Democrat. And maybe in the long run, from a political standpoint, I pick up some support. But in the short run, I'm going to lose support, right? I'm going to lose the support of Southerners who feel like civil rights is not something we should pursue. Southern whites, I should say there. Southern whites believing that we should not pursue civil rights, okay? Now, I might also lose them to more radical views like Harry Byrd over here with his segregation. We'll see another candidate down the road here in a bit, Henry Wallace. Wallace's standpoint, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Ouch, right? That is even more rough on the stance. But if I'm Kennedy, I'm looking at the South going, man, I know I should do something about civil rights. I know guys like the Reverend King are calling my phone every day to make me do something about it. But if I do something, I'm going to lose the South. And looking at the map of the country, the Republican Party is doing well enough in other places that I just can't win anymore. So that's the dilemma if you're Kennedy. Now, let's also put in the background of this, Kennedy thinks if he starts leaning to the left, someone's going to call him communist. And he doesn't want that to happen either. That's still a label that someone would want to plap onto the poor guy. Now, if I'm Kennedy, that means I'm going to drag my feet. Absolutely the Kennedy stance on civil rights, dragging of feet. And we'll start to see what motivates him, I beg your pardon, here in a moment. But you do have, under the Kennedy regime, not enough happening on civil rights. Now, as I said, the political reality is what it is. It is a very shaky hold on the South, but it is also an opportunity that Kennedy should embrace, right? Remember all that? Ask not, we stand here at the brink of a new dawn, the breaking of a new society, freedom, hope, democracy. Yeah. You know how much of that speech was about civil rights, that great 1961 inaugural address? Zero. Nothing. No civil rights in there. Interesting. You got elected with like 84% of the African-American vote. You didn't get throw a bone in the speech? Oh, interesting stance there, Kennedy. It's one of the reasons I go, Kennedy. People talk about him like he's, I'm going to rant for a moment here, right? People talk about him like he's this transcendent God. He was the president of the United States from January of 1961 to November of 1963. What's that? It's like less than 3 years. Major domestic achievements, not many. Civil rights achievements, only when he was forced. Foreign policy, I'll give you a little bit there. Personal affairs, unless we're talking about golf and actual affairs, there ain't much going on that's, there. All right, that's the rant. My dog has even left the room. The dog's like, I'm not going to listen to this anymore. He's just ranting. My dog doesn't like me. Okay, go back to it, Holiday, will you? All right. In 1963, the two biggest events of the civil rights movement for Kennedy's legacy take place. The first is the march in Birmingham. I have a video here. If you would go and watch that, that would help us. Go ahead. Time out to watch the video. You're back. Okay. This is one of those moments that really puts the pressure on. And I want to cut to the chase on this. What motivates Kennedy? Television. That's it. In 1963, the average American is sitting down and watching the television and thinking to themselves, that's happening in our country? That's happening here? In our nation? That looks like something that happens in a third world dictatorship, not here in our states. But there it is. And Kennedy, as long as he is not pushed, seems to drag his feet on civil rights. But this pushes him. Okay, now those protests that you saw there eventually led to the imprisonment of thousands of people. Martin Luther King Jr. spends 9 days in jail himself during the period protesting against the segregationist policies of Bull Connor. Okay, but when you start to see change take place, it looks like promises. Kennedy gets on the TV. He says, I'm going to call for an end to discrimination in the United States. This is something that Martin Luther King Jr. urges him to do. It's something that he promises. It is April 1963. Now, in all fairness, when the president dies in November of 1963, he was working on it, but he hadn't achieved it. That message will be left for his successor, Lyndon Johnson, to take care of. Okay. Which brings us to the end of the run here, the March on Washington, D.C., the largest public demonstration in the history of the United States to that point. 250,000 people is the estimated number. Sometimes you read in books that it could have been 400, 500,000 people. It is hot. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C. in the summer, hot, sweaty, muggy, So you can see in the people who are gathered around, when you watch the video here in a moment, you can see how hot and how sweaty they look, but you can also see how moved they are by what's taking place. So please go and watch the video for a moment. Time out. A couple things I want to note. Number one, few human beings in the history of mankind have been better with words than Martin Luther King Jr. There are some phrases in that every year when I watch that video, I go, God, that is beautiful. That is well said. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. has his faults too. I'm not looking to just be like, he did this and he did that. But Martin Luther King Jr. had a lot of personal connections with other folks. Let's put it that way. That's what the FBI always used against him. They always threatened to expose his extramarital affairs as a way of trying to lessen his influence. But that was something that was pretty well known within the civil rights movement. But man, that message that he brings out there is powerful, and it is almighty, and it is just brilliant. And unfortunately for Martin Luther King Jr., this is as good as it's going to get. Now, King is 5 years from his very, very early untimely death, but this is as united as the peaceful branch of the civil rights movement is going to be. I'll give you an example. One of the speakers who spoke that day was the organizer of the SNCCs, the SNCCs, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committees, okay, John Lewis. Lewis, for the record, still alive. He represents one of the congressional districts of Georgia today. Unfortunately, he was diagnosed with, I think it's pancreatic cancer at the end of last year, and he's undergoing treatment for that. But best wishes to John Lewis. John Lewis, a major force in the civil rights movement. Lewis wanted to say on that day in August 1963 a much stronger line than they let him. In other words, this was part of the original speech. Let me read to you for a moment. He encouraged blacks to free ourselves from the chains of political and economic slavery. That's not that bad all day. Okay. He went on, though, to say that we should march through the heart of Dixie the way Sherman did and burn Jim Crow to the ground. And the organizers that day wouldn't let him say it because they thought that it was too divisive, that it spoke to violence instead of nonviolence. And I'll tell you what, that's where things are headed. As much as Martin Luther King Jr. is the organizing influence of this civil rights moment, his power is a little bit on the wane, on the decline, to say it another way. And the reason for that is that the results haven't happened. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. It is now 1963 and segregation is still rife. right? The average African American is still living in a Jim Crow South, still unable to sit in a restaurant, sit in a rail car, eat at a table with, go to a school with their white counterpart, however you want to phrase that. And that's frustrating. So, what we're going to start to see from here is a more violent response. The civil rights movements of the 60s are much more, and I don't want to use harsh language here, but they're much more aggressive. They're much more willing to say, maybe nonviolence hasn't served the movement perfectly well. Maybe what we need is some pushback. Maybe when we are being beaten with sticks and we are attacked by dogs, we should fight back. Maybe that's the solution for the future. So if you look at Martin Luther King Jr.'s moment there, this is the moment. Now, he's going to continue to campaign and crusade, but as far as the ability to kind of bring together the movement in order to be one voice, that is the day where it pinnacles. After that, we're going to see it headed down, okay? Now, this unit really ends then with the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And there are years, or there have been some years, where I show the video of Kennedy being assassinated. You'll notice that I didn't include it here. If you are the sort of person who wants to go and watch such a thing, you can look up HD images, JFK death, and they have slowed down the Zapruder film. That's the one surviving good camera evidence of the JFK assassination, to the point where you can see that man's head explode. If that's something that you're not up for, let me warn you right here, don't go do it. If you are a squeamish human being, don't go do it. Because it is very real and very, it happens, and it makes you recoil as a human being. Now, maybe you're the sort of person who right now is typing it in like, oh, I got to go see this now. Okay, but I wanted to say fair warning, because the assassination is an absolutely gruesome moment. Now, who killed him? Well, the Warren Commission, headed by our guy Earl Warren, would tell you that he was killed by a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Oswald was killed the next day by a man with ties to the mob, Jack Ruby. End of story, case closed. If, on the other hand, you're a conspiracy person, well, the internet is going to be your friend. You can find out all sorts of theories about who killed JFK. The mob, maybe the Teamsters, maybe the military-industrial complex, maybe the Cubans, maybe the Soviets, maybe Lyndon Johnson had him killed. All those theories have a little bit of flutter to them, and you can go read about them and have a look at it, and sort of find where you think the truth is. Or you can go, I don't know, I don't want to think about that at all. Fair play either way. This is the end of the unit, though, and what will follow in the next couple of days is a test like the one we took on the last unit, with a series of questions asking you to kind of think critically about the material in the unit. I hope you're well, ladies and gentlemen. Take care of yourselves. I appreciate you sticking with me through the video here. All the best to you. Bye-bye.